It started with subtle torment. It did not begin with open hostility. It began with something harder to prove, something that lingered just beneath the surface. A tone slightly sharper than necessary. A private remark that felt strategically placed. A pattern of undermining disguised as humor. A question that was not really a question, but an accusation hidden in politeness. Subtle torment is rarely dramatic. It is patient. It studies you. It looks for your soft spots. It probes your confidence in small increments. It does not want to explode, it wants to erode. And what made this different was that you were not engaged in conflict. You were living your life, carrying responsibilities, protecting your peace, building something steady and meaningful. Yet they kept circling. They tested your reactions. They watched your composure. They attempted to create instability not with a single strike, but with repeated friction. The goal was not resolution. The goal was control. They wanted to see you flinch. They wanted to see you react. They wanted confirmation that they could reach inside your emotional world and rearrange it. But what they did not anticipate was your restraint. You refused to play the game. There comes a moment when you realize this is not a misunderstanding that needs explanation. It is a pattern that feeds on reaction. And that is where everything changed. They expected you to defend yourself loudly. They expected emotion. They expected you to correct every distortion, to argue every accusation, to chase resolution in conversations that were never designed for resolution. Because the structure of their behavior depended on one thing, your engagement. But you did not engage. You did not raise your voice. You did not gather witnesses. You did not campaign to clear your name. You stepped back. That decision may have looked quiet on the outside, but inwardly it required discipline. It required restraint when your integrity was questioned. It required composure when your character was subtly undermined. It required strength to resist the impulse to prove yourself. You recognized something vital. The conflict was not about truth, it was about control. And once you saw that, you refused to participate. Silence, in that context, was not weakness. It was sovereignty. It was the deliberate choice to remove yourself from a system that thrived on emotional reaction. When they provoked, you did not respond. When they implied, you did not defend. When they attempted to draw you into circular conversations, you declined the invitation. You redirected your attention toward your responsibilities, your work, your spiritual grounding. You stopped volunteering for chaos. That withdrawal unsettled them more than any confrontation would have, because a narcissistic spirit survives on reaction. It feeds on emotional exchange. It measures its power by how quickly it can shift your mood, disturb your confidence, or force you into defense. But you became still, and stillness is threatening to someone who depends on friction. Your calmness communicated something they did not expect. You were no longer accessible to manipulation. The usual hooks did not land. The familiar tactics did not stir you. The subtle provocations that once might have unsettled you now passed without impact. You were no longer participating in the performance. And without an audience, performance collapses. They interpreted your restraint as rejection. They interpreted your distance as defiance. Because when someone is accustomed to emotional dominance, your refusal to engage feels like loss of control. But you were not rebelling. You were protecting your peace. There is a difference between fighting someone and refusing to be dragged into their disorder. You understood that difference. You understood that not every accusation deserves a response. Not every distortion requires correction. Not every misunderstanding needs endless clarification. You stopped explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. And that changed the balance. Because once you withdraw from manipulation, manipulation loses leverage. They were left holding tension with no outlet. They were left with accusations that could not provoke collapse. They were left facing a reality they could not bend. And that internal pressure did not disappear. It intensified. Your silence became a mirror. Your composure became a confrontation. Your peace exposed their instability. When someone expects you to break and you remain steady, it unsettles their entire structure, because their influence depended on your reaction. And now you were no longer reacting. You were moving forward. You were rebuilding strength. You were anchoring yourself in something deeper than their opinion. That refusal did not end the conflict immediately. It revealed it. It exposed that the entire dynamic depended on your participation, and without your participation, the structure began to crack. You did not defeat them with aggression. You disarmed them with restraint. You did not match their energy. You rose above it, and that elevation created distance they could not tolerate. Because when you close the door to manipulation without anger, without spectacle, without revenge, you silently declare, "I will not surrender my peace to your disorder." And once that declaration is lived out, not announced, not dramatized, but embodied, the balance shifts permanently. That is when ego begins to transform into obsession. Obsession replaces ego. When you refused to play the game, something inside them shifted. At first, it was wounded pride, the discomfort of not being able to move you the way they once could, the irritation of losing emotional access. But pride, when it is not humbled, rarely remains contained. It hardens. What began as ego soon became fixation. They could not tolerate your independence. They could not understand how you walked away without chasing closure, without demanding apology, without fighting for the last word. Your silence unsettled them, not because it was cruel, but because it was complete. You did not leave the door half open. You closed it with dignity. And for someone who thrives on control, that kind of closure feels like humiliation. So they began revisiting you, not physically perhaps, but mentally. They replayed conversations. They reframed memories. They reconstructed events in ways that made them appear injured and you appear cold. This is how obsession disguises itself as justification. They told themselves they were simply correcting a wrong. But beneath that narrative was something far less noble. They could not release the need to win. When ego is threatened, it searches for recovery. It looks for a way to restore superiority. And if reconciliation does not restore it, domination will attempt to. You became the symbol of what they could not control. And instead of asking why your composure disturbed them, they blamed you for the disturbance. This is the moment when ego crosses into obsession, when someone can no longer tolerate your stability because it exposes their instability. You were not attacking them. You were not interfering in their life. You were not retaliating. Yet they kept circling. They asked about you indirectly. They listened for signs of weakness. They waited for evidence that you were struggling, that you regretted stepping away, that you were unraveling. But you were not unraveling. You were rebuilding, and your growth felt like defiance. To a narcissistic spirit, your progress without them feels like rejection of their importance. Your peace without their approval feels like an insult. Your strength without their validation feels like betrayal. So they intensified internally. Obsession is not loud at first. It is quiet calculation. It is the repeated mental rehearsal of scenarios that never occur. It is the constant checking, the constant wondering, the constant attempt to maintain psychological presence in your life, even after you have withdrawn. And that constant attention consumes them, because obsession requires energy. It requires narrative maintenance. It requires continuous justification. They cannot simply move on, because moving on would require humility. It would require admitting that their tactics failed. It would require acknowledging that you did not belong to their control. So instead of humility, they choose fixation. They reinterpret your restraint as arrogance. They reinterpret your boundaries as cruelty. They reinterpret your silence as hostility. Distortion becomes the shield protecting their pride. But distortion cannot erase truth. The truth remains that you did nothing to provoke ongoing hostility, and deep down, they know it. That knowledge is what fuels the obsession, because when someone attacks a person who is not attacking them, they must invent a reason. They must create a narrative where their aggression feels justified. Without that narrative, they would have to confront the reality that their actions were driven by insecurity. And insecurity exposed is unbearable to pride. So the fixation deepens. What they once attempted casually, they now pursue with intensity. What began as subtle undermining becomes active monitoring. What began as irritation becomes preoccupation. But here is what they fail to see. Obsession does not weaken you. It weakens them, because while they are studying your movements, you are moving forward. While they are rehearsing arguments in their mind, you are building stability in real life. While they are trying to preserve control over an image, you are strengthening your character. Their world begins revolving around a battle you have already left, and that imbalance creates strain. Strain that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The more they attempt to reassert control over your narrative, the more control slips from their own life. The more they fixate on your peace, the more unrest grows within them. Because obsession is not power, it is fear wearing armor, and fear, when left unaddressed, does not calm down. It escalates. That escalation marks the moment when fixation becomes action. The line was crossed. Obsession, if left unchecked, never remains internal. It eventually moves outward. There is a point when fixation stops being private tension and becomes deliberate action. A moment when wounded pride chooses persistence over reflection. That moment is the line, and they crossed it. At first, you may have sensed it subtly, the shift from irritation to intention. Their words carried sharper edges. Their behavior became more strategic. What once felt reactive now felt calculated. They were no longer simply unsettled. They were determined. Determined to disturb your peace. Determined to undermine your progress. Determined to insert themselves back into your emotional field in any way possible. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about interference. They knew you had stepped away. They knew you were not fighting them. They knew you had chosen restraint, and still they pressed forward. That is when the nature of the conflict changes. There is a difference between emotional immaturity and deliberate harm, between insecurity and sustained hostility, between a bruised ego and a hardened heart. When someone continues to pursue your destabilization after you have withdrawn, it reveals something deeper than pride. It reveals defiance. Defiance against truth. Because the truth was evident. You were not attacking them. You were not speaking against them. You were not recruiting others. You were simply living your life beyond their reach. Yet they could not allow that distance to stand. And so they crossed the line from internal obsession to outward action. Perhaps they escalated gossip. Perhaps they attempted to manipulate others against you. Perhaps they sought opportunities to provoke reaction publicly, hoping to create a crack in your composure. Whatever the form, the motive was clear. Regain control. But control gained through interference is unstable. They were no longer reacting to your behavior. They were reacting to your peace. And peace is difficult to attack directly, so they attacked indirectly. They challenged your character. They questioned your motives. They hinted at narratives designed to cast doubt. But what they did not realize is that persistence without justification eventually exposes itself. The more they pushed, the clearer the imbalance became. You were moving forward quietly. They were chasing you emotionally. You were strengthening inwardly. They were unraveling outwardly. This is the moment where accountability begins to shift from private discomfort to visible consequence. Because there is a spiritual law woven into reality, sustained injustice cannot continue indefinitely without correction. For a season, pride is allowed to speak. For a time, ego is permitted to maneuver. But when someone knowingly continues harm against a person who is not harming them, they enter dangerous territory. Not because you retaliate, but because truth does not remain silent forever. They crossed the line when they chose persistence over humility. They crossed the line when they continued to press after it was clear you were not engaging. They crossed the line when they decided that your peace was unacceptable. And in crossing that line, they unknowingly triggered something greater than the conflict itself. Because once a person persists in interference against someone walking in integrity, the dynamic is no longer personal. It becomes instructional. Correction begins not as spectacle, not as dramatic punishment, but as unraveling. Doors that once opened easily begin to resist. Alliances that once felt secure begin to weaken. Confidence that once seemed unshakable begins to tremble, not because you pushed, but because persistence without righteousness collapses under its own weight. They mistook your restraint for vulnerability. They mistook your silence for passivity. They mistook your withdrawal for defeat. And in doing so, they overreached. That overreach is what crossing the line looks like. It is the moment when arrogance assumes immunity. But no one operates indefinitely without consequence. The line has been crossed, and once crossed, the trajectory changes. The next stage does not arrive with noise. It arrives with shift. A shift in momentum, a shift in protection, a shift that signals something has begun to move beyond their control. Divine intervention begins. When the line is crossed, the atmosphere changes. Not immediately in ways the eye can measure, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with shift, a subtle reordering beneath the surface. The kind of shift that is not announced, it unfolds. Divine intervention rarely looks dramatic at first. It looks like resistance where there used to be momentum. It looks like friction where there used to be ease. It looks like instability forming quietly under carefully constructed ground. They do not recognize it right away. At first, they attribute it to coincidence, to bad timing, to other people, to stress, to circumstance. They look outward for explanation, because looking inward would require humility. But something has begun. When someone persists in harming a person who has chosen peace, when they continue pressing against boundaries that were clearly drawn, a correction enters the equation. Not vengeance, correction. The same force that protects integrity also confronts arrogance. And that confrontation is not chaotic, it is precise. The influence they once carried begins to thin. The confidence they projected begins to feel fragile. The alliances they relied upon begin to show cracks. Words that once persuaded begin to lose weight. The very tools they used to manipulate begin turning against them. Gossip breeds mistrust. Control breeds resentment. Aggression breeds distance. And slowly, without announcement, the structure they built on ego begins to destabilize. Meanwhile, you are not intervening. You are not campaigning. You are not orchestrating exposure. You are continuing forward, strengthening your inner life, tending to your responsibilities, guarding your peace. That contrast matters, because divine intervention does not require your participation in their downfall. It requires your refusal to join their disorder. While they attempt to regain control through pressure, you remain anchored, and anchoring matters. Because instability reveals itself most clearly when contrasted with steadiness. They begin to feel strain. Plans do not unfold as smoothly. Influence does not land as effectively. The emotional charge they once generated around your name loses intensity. People begin to notice inconsistencies, not because you announce them, because repetition reveals pattern, and pattern, over time, exposes character. Intervention does not scream, it constricts. It removes support gradually. It allows pride to extend itself until the weight becomes too heavy to sustain. What once felt effortless begins to feel exhausting. What once felt controlled begins to feel uncertain. What once felt powerful begins to feel fragile. And in that fragility, tension builds. They sense something slipping: control, narrative, authority. But instead of recognizing correction, they may interpret it as challenge. That misinterpretation leads to escalation. Yet escalation only accelerates instability, because when correction begins, pushing harder does not restore power, it magnifies weakness. The ground beneath them is no longer solid, and they do not understand why. They blame others. They blame circumstances. They blame you. But deep within, there is awareness, a quiet recognition that something has shifted. The protection surrounding you is no longer subtle. It is active, not loud, not aggressive, but firm. You are no longer absorbing the pressure they send. You are no longer carrying the emotional weight of their hostility. That weight has begun returning to its source, not as revenge, as consequence. Divine intervention is not emotional. It is structural. It does not aim to humiliate. It aims to reveal. And what is being revealed is this: you cannot persist in interference against integrity without destabilizing yourself. You cannot wage quiet warfare against someone who is withdrawn and expect to remain untouched. You cannot build influence on distortion and expect it to endure. The correction has begun, not because you demanded justice, but because justice does not ignore persistence. And while this shift unfolds, one response remains within their control: humility. If they bend, the instability can settle. If they reflect, the pressure can ease. But if they resist, then what began as quiet correction becomes accelerated, unraveling, the stubborn one who won't stop. When correction begins, most people feel it. They sense the resistance. They notice the friction. They recognize that something is not aligning the way it once did. And in that awareness, they have a choice: step back or push harder. There is always one who pushes harder. Within every unraveling, there is a personality that refuses to bend. Someone who interprets consequence as coincidence. Someone who believes they can outmaneuver exposure. Someone who sees every closed door not as instruction, but as insult. This is the stubborn one. While others grow cautious, this person grows aggressive. While others begin to reflect, this person doubles down. Because to bend would require admitting they were wrong. And admitting wrong would fracture the identity they have carefully constructed. So instead of humility, they choose force. Instead of silence, they escalate. They attempt to reassert dominance through louder words, sharper accusations, bolder interference. They may try to regain influence by recruiting others again. They may attempt one final surge of pressure, believing intensity can restore control. But intensity cannot rebuild what pride has weakened. In fact, escalation only accelerates instability, because when correction has already begun, resistance does not protect, it exposes. The stubborn one mistakes endurance for power. They believe persistence proves strength. But there is a profound difference between resilience and rigidity. Resilience bends and survives. Rigidity resists and breaks. And what makes this stage so critical is that they sense something slipping. Influence feels thinner, authority feels questioned, confidence feels less secure, and that sensation of loss triggers desperation. Desperation speaks louder. It pushes harder. It risks more. But the louder they become, the clearer the imbalance appears. You are not escalating. You are not responding. You are not engaging. The contrast becomes undeniable. Their behavior grows reactive, while yours remains steady. And in that contrast, something becomes visible to others. What once might have been interpreted as mutual conflict now appears one-sided. What once looked like disagreement now looks like pursuit. What once seemed ambiguous now feels excessive. The stubborn one cannot see this clearly because pride narrows perception. They believe one more attempt will restore equilibrium. One more push, one more accusation, one more maneuver. But the structure has already shifted. When someone refuses humility after intervention begins, they move themselves closer to collapse. Not because someone is attacking them, because they are exhausting themselves. Sustained hostility drains clarity. It erodes judgment. It clouds discernment. The more they escalate, the more reckless they appear. The more reckless they appear, the less credible they become. And credibility, once fractured, is difficult to reclaim. The stubborn one believes they are fighting for dominance. In reality, they are accelerating exposure. They believe pressure will intimidate. In reality, pressure reveals fragility. Because when a person cannot tolerate peace existing beyond their control, their reactions betray insecurity. And insecurity, when amplified, becomes visible. At this stage, the path narrows. Humility would soften the fall. Reflection would stabilize the ground. But if stubbornness remains, then what began as correction moves toward collapse. The tension has been building. The instability has been forming. And now, with escalation replacing restraint, the final stage approaches. The crash. It arrives as collapse. Not the kind that makes headlines. Not the kind that explodes in a single dramatic moment. It is quieter than that. More internal. More exposing. By the time it comes, the strain has already been building. Correction was offered. Resistance intensified. Pride doubled down. Escalation replaced humility. And now, the structure that once appeared stable can no longer support the weight placed upon it. The crash is not an act of revenge. It is the consequence of overextension. When someone builds their identity on control, manipulation, and superiority, they must constantly maintain that image. They must defend it, reinforce it, protect it from contradiction. But contradiction has been forming for some time. Their words no longer align with their behavior. Their narratives no longer persuade with the same force. The tension they generate no longer creates fear. It creates discomfort in others. And slowly, the environment around them begins to shift. People notice. Patterns emerge. Inconsistencies become harder to ignore. The crash is not chaos. It is exposure. The exposure of insecurity that once hid behind aggression. The exposure of control that once disguised itself as confidence. The exposure of instability that once projected strength. And exposure feels like loss. Loss of influence. Loss of authority. Loss of narrative control. For someone who depended on dominance, this feels catastrophic. They attempt one last surge, a final assertion, a sharper tone, a louder claim, but it does not land the way it once did. The ground is no longer responsive. The structure no longer holds. Because pride cannot sustain itself indefinitely against truth. The crash is the moment when illusion gives way to reality. The illusion that they could torment without consequence. The illusion that your peace was fragile. The illusion that persistence would eventually break you. Instead, It was their persistence that wore thin. And here is the deeper layer of this collapse. You did not cause it. You did not orchestrate it. You did not push them toward it. You stepped away. You guarded your composure. You refused the game. And while you were strengthening inwardly, they were straining outwardly. The imbalance became unsustainable. The crash is not destruction. It is confrontation. Confrontation with the limits of their control. Confrontation with the fragility of their image. Confrontation with the truth that manipulation cannot hold indefinitely against integrity. This moment feels disorienting to them, because when someone has long believed they were the architect of every outcome, discovering limits feels like collapse. But the collapse was not sudden. It was cumulative. Each escalation added weight. Each refusal of humility tightened strain. Each attempt to regain control weakened their foundation, until finally the structure could not stand, and in that collapse, silence replaces noise. Because when pride falls, it falls inward. The crash is not loud for long. It becomes quiet, reflective, unavoidable, and in that quiet, the lesson begins to settle, not as humiliation, as reality. The reality that you cannot persist in torment against someone walking in restraint without destabilizing yourself. The reality that peace guarded with discipline cannot be dismantled by aggression. The reality that arrogance, when stretched too far, fractures. The crash is not the end of their story. It is the end of their illusion. And what remains is the final stage. Respect learned not through fear, but through consequence. God is teaching them respect. The collapse was never the point. The lesson is, respect is not forced through fear. It is learned through consequence. When someone persists in tormenting what they cannot control, they eventually confront the limits of their power, not because you retaliated, not because you fought harder, but because integrity does not require aggression to endure. What unfolded was not revenge, it was correction, and the deeper value in all of this is not their fall, it is your formation. You did not become bitter, you did not become reactive, you did not surrender your peace to chaos. You chose restraint when retaliation would have been easier. You chose composure when confrontation would have been satisfying. You chose dignity when drama was available. That is strength, and that strength is what remains. Some will learn respect through humility, others will learn it through collapse, but the truth stands. Peace protected by discipline cannot be dismantled by pride. So do not fixate on their downfall. Guard your stability. Continue forward, because the real victory was never watching them fall. It was walking away without losing yourself.